Imagine the smell of pine and wet earth in the middle of the night, a darkness so complete, so total, that you cannot see your own hand when you hold it inches from your face. The air is cold, that specific kind of cold that Mississippi October nights carry, the kind that sinks into your bones and stays there. Somewhere far behind you, back through the trees, back through the swamp and the kudzu and the long silence of a world that has forgotten you exist, you can hear them. Dogs not barking the way a dog barks at a squirrel or a stranger at the gate. This is different. This is a sound that carries purpose. A sound trained and sharpened over years into a single function: find, pursue, destroy, and you are 12 years old. You have no shoes, no food, no map. You are wearing the same thin cotton dress you scrubbed floors in this morning, and it is soaking wet from the creek you just climbed out of, and your feet are bleeding, and you have no idea where you are going, only that you have to keep moving, because behind you, 3 Rottweilers weighing over 100 pounds each have your scent. And the man who released them does not want you back alive. He wants you to serve as a lesson. This is the story of Amelia. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. This story did not happen in 1820. It did not happen before the Civil War, before Lincoln, before the 13th Amendment. This story happened in 1891, 26 years after slavery was abolished in the United States, 26 years after 4 million enslaved people were declared free by the law of the land. And yet here she is, running for her life through a Mississippi forest, because someone decided the law didn't apply to them. Let me take you back to the beginning. Amelia was born in 1879 on the Thornhill Plantation in rural Mississippi. Now, when I say rural, I want you to really feel what that word means here. This wasn't just countryside. This was deliberate isolation. The plantation sat deep behind forests, behind swampland, behind miles of nothing. The nearest town was a long journey on foot. The nearest sheriff was, by most accounts, paid to look the other way. Mail didn't come. Visitors didn't arrive uninvited. The outside world, for all practical purposes, did not exist. And that was exactly how Thomas Thornhill wanted it. You see, Thomas Thornhill had inherited the plantation from his father, and along with the land, the house, and the cotton fields, he had inherited something else. A lie, a monstrous, deliberate, carefully maintained lie, because when the war ended in 1865 and emancipation became the law of the United States, the Thornhill family simply didn't tell anyone. The 43 people who lived and worked and died on that land were never informed. Not in 1865, not in 1870, not in 1880. They woke up every morning believing they were still property. They worked believing they had no choice. They stayed because they had been told, over and over and over again, that running meant death. And for some of them, it did. Amelia's mother died giving birth to her. Her father was sold, or transferred, or simply removed. The records are unclear. Before she was old enough to remember his face. She was raised by an elderly woman named Ruth, who had been on the Thornhill Plantation longer than almost anyone. Ruth was the kind of woman who carried entire histories inside her, the kind who spoke in whispers late at night when the overseers were asleep, who pressed stories into children's minds like seeds, into soil, hoping something would grow. And Ruth told Amelia things, dangerous things. She told her about a war that was supposed to have ended all of this. She told her that somewhere beyond those trees, black people lived free. She told her that by the law of the country they were standing on, They had been free for over a decade. But she also told her never to say those words out loud, because Thomas Thornhill had killed people for less. Amelia worked in the main house. She scrubbed floors on her knees. She carried heavy buckets of water from the well before sunrise. She served meals to the Thornhill family and was told she was fortunate to eat what scraps remained. She learned, the way so many children in impossible situations learn, to make herself invisible, to move quietly, to take up as little space as possible, to never, ever let them see what was burning inside her, but it was burning. Ruth had planted something that refused to die. Asterisk, if we're free, why are we still here? Asterisk, that question lived in Amelia like a coal. And on the night of October 14th, 1891, it finally caught fire. She slipped out just after midnight. She took nothing with her, no food, no blanket, no shoes, nothing that might slow her down or create noise. Just the thin cotton dress and the darkness and whatever courage a 12-year-old girl can hold in her chest when she knows that what she's doing might get her killed. The moon that night was barely a sliver. It offered almost no light. She ran anyway. She ran east, because Ruth had told her once that east led to a river, and the river led to towns where black people lived free. Ruth said it was 2 days on foot if you knew the way. Amelia didn't know the way, but she ran. Now here's what I want you to think about for a moment. This child had never been beyond the borders of that plantation in her entire life. She had no frame of reference for what the outside world looked like. She didn't know the name of the nearest town. She didn't know which direction safety lay in any meaningful, practical sense. She was running blind into absolute darkness on pure, desperate faith. That is a specific kind of courage that most of us will never be asked to summon. Back at the plantation, she was discovered missing within the hour. A woman woke in the night to use the outhouse, noticed Amelia's sleeping pallet was empty, checked the kitchen, checked the house, and then, out of a fear that is painful to think about, went. It woke the overseer. His name was Cyrus Gan. Cyrus had been overseeing Thornhill's operation for 9 years. He was, by all accounts, a man who did not do his job out of necessity or obligation. He did it because he enjoyed it. He had caught runaways before. He knew the woods. He knew the tricks they used, the water, the doubling back, the hiding. And he had 3 dogs that had never, not once, failed to bring someone back. He walked to the dog pen with Amelia's blanket in his hand. The 3 Rottweilers were named Brutus, Caesar, and Nero. They'd been trained since puppies. Cyrus kept them lean and hungry because hungry dogs are focused dogs. He held the blanket to their noses. He watched their eyes change, that particular hardening that happens when a scent-trained animal locks onto a target. Then he opened the gate. "Find her," he said. Amelia heard them before she could process what it meant. She was maybe a mile into the woods when the barking started, distant at first, almost like it could belong to something else, something harmless. Then closer, then so close she could hear the rhythm of 3 sets of paws hammering the earth behind her. Her body understood before her mind did. She stopped thinking and started running. Branches tore at her face. Thorns opened her feet. She couldn't see where she was going and she tripped, fell, got back up, tripped again, got back up again. The barking was getting louder, and then she found the creek. It was cold and fast, moving, and she remembered something Ruth had told her once, something Ruth had heard from someone who had tried to run decades before her. Water hides your scent. She didn't hesitate. She jumped in. The current grabbed her. The water came up to her chest and made her dress impossibly heavy. She grabbed onto a rock and held on, submerged to her neck, shaking so hard her teeth clattered together. And she waited. The barking stopped. For a long, crystalline moment, There was nothing but the sound of moving water and her own heartbeat. And then she heard it, the sniffing. The dogs were at the edge of the creek, upstream, pacing back and forth, confused by the broken trail. She could hear them. She let go of the rock. She let the current carry her farther downstream, keeping only her head above the surface, moving silently through the dark. They found her trail again on the other bank. She pulled herself out of the water and ran. Her dress clung to her. Her legs felt like they were dragging stone. Her lungs were on fire. She ran for another hour, maybe more. Time had dissolved. There was only the running and the closing distance of those dogs, and the darkness that swallowed everything ahead of her. She was lost. She knew it. The trees all looked the same. She had no landmark, no star she could identify, no way of knowing which direction she was moving. She was simply moving away, and she was running out of body to do it with. Then she saw the cabin. It was half collapsed, barely standing. The roof had caved in on one side. Vines had swallowed most of the walls. The door hung off its hinges like a broken jaw. It looked like it had been abandoned for 20 years. But when the barking was maybe 50 yards behind you and your feet were bleeding and your legs were giving out, a broken cabin was a cathedral. She ran inside, pulled the door shut, pressed her back against the wall and slid down to the floor. Her chest heaved, her whole body shook. She looked around. Nothing inside. No furniture. No tools, just rotting wood and dirt and shadows. She crawled to the farthest corner. She curled into a ball, and she prayed. She told herself she didn't know if God listened to girls like her. She prayed anyway. The barking was right outside. She could hear their claws on the wooden walls. She could hear them sniffing at every gap and crack in the door. She held her breath. She made herself as small as she could. Then one of the dogs barked, sharp, triumphant, certain. They had her. The door exploded inward. Brutus came first. His teeth were bared. His eyes were wild. Caesar and Nero came in right behind him, filling that tiny broken cabin with noise and fury and all the violence that had been trained into them. Amelia screamed. She pressed herself into the corner. There was nowhere to go. Brutus lunged, and the floor gave way. The rotted wood snapped under their combined weight, and Amelia dropped straight down into darkness, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the air out of her lungs. She lay there gasping, blinking, trying to understand what had happened. Above her she could hear the dogs, barking, clawing, furious, but they weren't coming down. The hole was too small. She was in a cellar, maybe 10 feet below the cabin floor. The dogs couldn't reach her. She sat in the pitch dark and listened to them rage above her, and she waited. Hours passed, real hours. The dogs didn't leave. They stayed at the edges of that hole in the floor, growling and snarling, and occasionally sending dirt cascading down onto her. Amelia's body ached in ways she had never felt before. Her feet were wet with blood. Her dress was still cold and damp. She wrapped her arms around herself and did the only thing she could do. She endured, and then the barking changed. It got quieter, uncertain. She heard the dogs move away from the hole. She heard their claws on the cabin floor, moving, distracted, as if they'd found something else. Then silence, complete silence. She didn't move. She didn't trust it. And then a voice came through the darkness. Girl, a woman's voice, old, rough around the edges, coming from somewhere above, inside the cabin. Girl, you down there? Amelia didn't answer. She'd survived this long by not trusting voices she didn't know. I ain't going to hurt you. Them dogs is gone. You can come up now. Her throat was so dry she could barely swallow. Who are you? She whispered. Someone who ain't supposed to be here neither. Come on up. I got water. The woman who reached down and helped pull Amelia out of that cellar was not what anyone would have expected to find in an abandoned cabin in the middle of a Mississippi forest in 1008, 191. Her name was Esther. She had silver hair and deep lines carved around her eyes by decades of sun and survival. She held a tin cup of water in one hand and a rusted knife in the other. She looked at Amelia the way a person looks at something they recognize, not the face, but the condition. The hunted look, the look of someone who has been running. Amelia drank the water. She drank the whole cup and felt it go down like something sacred. Then she asked the question that had been circling her mind from the moment she heard that voice. Where did the dogs go? Esther smiled. It was a sad smile, knowing in a way that went beyond words. I sent them away, she said. Same way I've been sending away everything that comes looking for me. I know things that scare dogs, things that scare men too. Now I want to pause here for a moment, because I know what some of you are thinking, and I want to be careful about how I tell this part of the story. What Esther described as root magic, knowledge passed from her grandmother to her, was something real, not supernatural, but deeply practical. Generations of enslaved people in the American South developed extensive knowledge of the natural world out of sheer necessity. Plants, roots, herbs, compounds with powerful effects on animals and people alike. This knowledge was kept alive through oral tradition because it was one of the few forms of power that could not be taken from them. When Esther said she knew things that scared dogs, she meant it literally, and it worked. Esther had been living in those woods for nearly 40 years. She had been enslaved once, on a different plantation in a different county. She had run when she was young. They sent dogs after her too, but she had survived, and she had learned, and she had made herself a ghost in the woods that no one could quite catch. Are they coming back? Amelia asked the dogs. No, but the men they going to come eventually, they always do. What do I do? Esther knelt down in front of her. She put a hand on Amelia's shoulder, and Amelia, this child who had been running and hiding and bleeding and terrified for hours, felt something in her chest go still for just a moment. You rest, Esther said, then you run again, but this time you run smart, and I'll show you the way. Amelia slept for 2 hours on the dirt floor of that broken cabin. When she woke, dawn was bleeding through the cracks in the walls in thin, pale lines. Esther sat near the door with her knife across her knees, watching the tree line. They'll come soon, she said without turning around. The dogs went back. The men will want to know why they came back without you. And here's the thing that strikes me every time I sit with this story. 8 hours had passed. Cyrus Gan had released those dogs, expecting them back in maybe 2. The fact that they returned empty, or rather, returned at all, confused and baffled, was, in the language of that plantation, a kind of miracle. And miracles, in places built on fear, are dangerous things, because they suggest that the system might not be as absolute as it was supposed to be. Esther had pulled something out of her stash, dried meat, a piece of hard bread, a tin of water, and wrapped Amelia's feet in strips of cloth torn from an old blanket. The cloth was rough, but it was better than bare skin on forest floor. As she tied it off, Amelia asked her the question that had been sitting in her throat since she first climbed out of that cellar. Why are you helping me? Esther didn't answer right away. She tied the last knot and sat back on her heels and looked at Amelia for a long moment. Because somebody helped me once, she said, long time ago, and I swore if I ever got the chance, I'd do the same. That's all, that's all. 2 words that contained an entire moral universe. She told Amelia not to go to the river. That's where they'd have men waiting. She told her to go north. 4 days through rough country, through swampland, past snakes and alligators and everything that wanted to kill her. But at the end of that path, there was a settlement. Free black people who didn't ask questions and didn't turn anyone away. Most people don't make it, Esther said. Most people don't make it here either, Amelia replied. Esther smiled for the second time. You got some fire in you, good, you'll need it. 15 minutes after Amelia disappeared into the trees, Cyrus Gan arrived at the cabin with 5 armed men. They surrounded it, kicked the door in, and found exactly one person inside. An old woman sitting calmly in the center of the room like she had nowhere better to be. Where is she? Cyrus demanded. Where's who? Esther asked. And what followed was a confrontation that I suspect Esther had rehearsed in her mind many times over the years, because she'd been doing it for decades. Cyrus Gan pointed a rifle at her face. She looked at him the way you look at a child throwing a tantrum. He found the hole in the floor, looked down into the empty cellar, turned back to her with fury in his eyes. She gave him nothing. When one of his own men finally said they were wasting time, that the girl was long gone, Cyrus lowered the rifle, made his threat, left. And Esther, this woman who had survived 40 years as a ghost in the Mississippi wilderness, picked up her knife, walked out the back of that cabin, and quietly disappeared. She had her own running to do. The swamp nearly killed Amelia. I want you to understand what crossing a Mississippi bayou on foot feels like when you have no shoes, open wounds on your feet, no way to see what's below the surface of the water. The swamp stretched out in front of her like a black mirror. Trees rose from the water with their roots twisted like broken hands. Moss hung from the branches. The water was warm and still in a way that meant things were living in it. She went through it anyway, chest deep in some places. Dark water she couldn't see through. Something brushed against her leg. She froze, waited, didn't breathe. It moved away. She kept walking. It took her 3 hours to cross. When she finally pulled herself out onto dry land on the other side, she collapsed. She lay there in the mud, covered in slime, smelling like decay. And for a long time she could not make herself stand up again. That's when she heard footsteps. A man emerged from the trees. He was black, tall, carrying a rifle. Amelia tried to stand, and her legs refused. She thought, asterisk, this is how it ends. Asterisk, the man stopped a few feet away and looked at her for a long moment. Then he lowered his rifle and set it on the ground. You running? He asked. Amelia said nothing. It's all right, he said. I ain't going to hurt you. I'm running too. His name was Marcus. He had been free for 6 months, had escaped his own situation, and was making his way north to the same settlement Esther had described. He sat down across from her in the mud, reached into his pack, and pulled out a piece of dried fish. He handed it to her without ceremony. Eat. You ain't going to make it anywhere on an empty stomach. She ate. And as she ate, she told him where she came from. When she said the name asterisk Thornhill Plantation asterisk, something changed in his face. First surprise, then a slow, burning anger. That place is supposed to be abandoned, he said. Everybody knows the war freed the slaves 30 years ago. Not there, Amelia said. Nobody told us. Nobody came. Marcus stood up and paced back and forth like a man trying to contain something large inside a small space. He stopped. He said, we got to tell somebody. When we get to the settlement, we got to tell somebody. They won't believe us, Amelia said. Nobody ever believes us. They will, Marcus said, because I'll make them. They traveled together for 3 more days. It was not a gentle journey. They were pursued at least twice, once close enough that they had to jump a ravine, and Amelia twisted her ankle on the landing and told Marcus to go without her, and he refused, climbed back down into the ravine to help her up himself, and said 4 words that I think about more than almost anything else in this story. Asterisk, we both make it. Asterisk, men with guns fired into the trees behind them. They ran, and then, at the end of the 3rd day, exhausted and broken and barely moving, they broke through the tree line. And there it was, a clearing, houses, real houses, with smoke coming from chimneys, gardens, laundry hanging in the morning light. People outside living. An old man with white hair and a beard stepped forward from the crowd with a walking cane and a voice that could carry weather. His name was Samuel. He had been born enslaved in Alabama, escaped at 16, come back south after the war to help build something. He called it New Hope. When the three men who had been chasing Amelia and Marcus burst through the trees behind them, Samuel walked forward and stood between them and the settlement. "Ain't no property here," he said, "just free people, and you're trespassing." More people stepped forward. Men and women, some with tools, some with guns. A line formed between the pursuers and the two exhausted people who had just arrived. The three men looked at each other, counted heads, backed away. "This ain't over," one of them said. "Yes, it is," Samuel replied. 2 days later, a federal marshal named Clayton rode into New Hope with 20 riders at his back, deputies, soldiers, official papers. Samuel had sent word to Jackson. Marcus had made sure the message was impossible to ignore. Amelia testified. She stood in front of a federal officer and told him everything. She was 12 years old, and she was terrified, and she told him anyway. She told him about the graves in the woods. She told him about the murders she had witnessed. She told him about the 6 people she had seen killed for running, or for speaking, or for nothing at all. When they rode to Thornhill Plantation, Amelia rode with them. The marshal had told her she didn't need to come. She told him, "Those people are my family. They need to see that somebody came back. They need to see that somebody cared." Thomas Thornhill came out onto his porch with a glass of whiskey and a smile that lasted right up until the moment Marshal Clayton told him he was under arrest for illegal enslavement, kidnapping, murder, and violation of the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The people from the shacks gathered slowly. They had heard the horses, they had seen the badges. They stood in a group, silent, afraid, because that is what decades of violence does. It makes you afraid of the thing that looks like rescue, because it has looked like rescue before and been something else. The marshal asked if they were free to leave. Silence. He asked if they were paid for their work. Silence. And then Amelia, this child who had crossed a swamp and outrun 3 trained dogs and fallen through a floor and walked 4 days on bleeding feet, stepped forward. "They're scared," she said loudly. "They've been punished their whole lives for telling the truth." She walked toward the group. Ruth reached out and grabbed her hand. "Child," she whispered, "what are you doing? What I should have done a long time ago." Amelia turned to face the marshal, and she told him everything, all of it, right there in front of Thornhill, in front of Cyrus Gan, in front of every man who had spent years enforcing a lie. When Thornhill called her a liar, she said, "If it's a lie, then why did you send dogs to kill me?" And then she turned to Ruth and asked her to show them. Ruth hesitated. Then slowly, she turned around and lifted the back of her shirt. Her back was covered in thick, raised scars. Old ones from years past, newer ones from more recent cruelties, years of beatings carved into her skin like a record that could never be erased. One by one, others turned, men, women, children, all marked, all carrying the evidence of what had been done to them. Marshal Clayton's hands balled into fists. He turned to Thornhill. "You're under arrest." Cyrus Gan tried to run. He made it 10 feet. Thomas Thornhill was dragged off his porch in handcuffs, screaming. And the people of the Thornhill Plantation, 40, 3 human beings who had lived their entire lives believing they were property, stood in silence and watched him go. Then someone started crying, then someone else, then everyone, not sad tears, something else entirely. Something that had no clean name. Relief and disbelief and grief and joy and 30 years of compressed, unanswered rage, all of it coming out at once, in the fading light of a Mississippi afternoon, on the land that was finally, truly theirs. Thomas Thornhill was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 20 years. He died in prison after 18 months. Heart attack. Cyrus Gan served 12 years of a 15-year sentence, then disappeared. The Rottweilers were never found. Amelia never asked about them. She didn't want to know. The people of Thornhill Plantation were given a choice: stay and work the land as free people with legal ownership rights, or leave. Most stayed. It was the only home they had ever known, but it would be theirs now, governed by themselves, documented in law. Amelia chose New Hope. Clara and her husband took her in like a daughter. Marcus taught her to read. She learned fast, voraciously, desperately, like someone who understood that knowledge was armor. Within 6 months, she could read better than most adults. She read books, newspapers, legal documents. She wanted to understand the world so thoroughly that no one could ever lie to her again. Ruth lived 2 houses down and grew a garden. She said it felt good to grow something for herself instead of someone else. Marcus married a woman from the settlement. They had a baby boy. He built houses with his hands and helped the community grow. And Amelia became a teacher. She taught children to read and write. She taught them their rights. She taught them history, the real history, not the version designed to make them small, but the version that showed them where they came from and what it cost to get to where they were. She made sure they knew. She made sure they understood that freedom was not a gift that had simply arrived one day. It was something people had suffered for, died for, run barefoot through swamps in the middle of the night for. One afternoon, a young girl came to her after class. "Miss Amelia," she said, "is it true you ran from dogs?" Amelia knelt down to look her in the eyes. "It's true. Were you scared?" "I was terrified every single second," Amelia said, "but I ran anyway. You want to know why?" The girl nodded. "Because being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. Being scared just means you're still alive. And as long as you're alive, you can choose. You can choose to give up, or you can choose to keep going. I chose to keep going, and that's what made all the difference. I want to sit with you here, at the end of this story, for just a moment. Because there's something about Amelia's story that goes beyond history, beyond the specific cruelty of what happened on that plantation. There's something here about the nature of lies, about what happens when a system is built entirely on deception, and how much violence it takes to maintain that deception, and how fragile it ultimately is in the face of one person who simply refuses to believe it. Thomas Thornhill spent 30 years convincing 43 people that they had no rights. And he almost succeeded, almost, but the thing about lies, even the biggest, most carefully constructed ones, is that they require the cooperation of the people they're told to. They require that person to accept the premise, to internalize it, to stop asking the question. And Amelia never stopped asking the question. Asterisk, if we're free, why are we still here? Asterisk, Ruth planted that question in a child's mind, knowing she might never see the answer. Esther passed along the tools of survival to someone she'd never met before that night. Marcus refused to leave someone behind at the edge of a ravine. Samuel stood in a clearing and said asterisk, no asterisk to men with guns. Each of these acts, small, human, unrecorded by any official history, formed a chain that stretched across a forest and a swamp and ended with 43 people standing in the sunlight on land they finally owned. The greatest weapon against oppression has never been the weapons themselves. It has always been the refusal to accept the lie, the refusal to believe that your chains are permanent, the refusal to stop asking why. Amelia was 12 years old. She had no shoes, no food, no map, no guarantee of anything except the certainty that staying was a kind of slow dying. she could no longer accept. She ran into absolute darkness, not knowing what was waiting for her. She fell through a floor. She crossed a swamp. She jumped a ravine on a twisted ankle. She stood in front of a federal marshal and told the truth in front of the men who had terrorized her entire life. She was not special in the sense that she had been given no particular advantages. She had no resources, no allies, no plan. What she had was the knowledge, planted by a woman named Ruth, decades before, in the dark, that she deserved better. And the courage, that terrifying, breathtaking, extraordinary courage, to act on it. That courage freed 43 people. And it proved something that people who build systems of oppression have always known and always feared. That one person, armed with nothing but the truth and the absolute refusal to pretend otherwise, can bring the whole structure down. The sun sets over New Hope. Smoke rises from chimneys. Children play in the streets. People sit on their porches and laugh. It isn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it is theirs, and that is everything. Asterisk for the unnamed ones who ran and didn't make it. For the ones who are still waiting to be found. For the ones who planted the questions, this story is for you. Asterisk.